Okay, great. Okay, so just for the sake of smoothness, do you want to mute everyone? So we can,
I can probably do that.
yeah, you can probably do the Ash.
I'm gonna mute you for a second as well, and then I'll unmute you.
No problem.
Loves power.
Well, I was asked to do it, wasn't I? So. Okay, wait.
Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everyone. It's really great to be with you tonight. And I think it's great to be with you because, well, first of all, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with you because it's great to be with you, and it's nice to be with so many familiar and unfamiliar faces. And also, what I really want to do is explore the time that we're in, because we're in a very, very, very powerful time. And you know, that powerful time contains within it a whole range of different experiences. Some of them are exceptionally painful, and some of them are completely liberating. And I just want to have a bit of a kind of overview, which will then lead, you know, that the format for tonight is going to be, we're going to have a small intro for 15 minutes, and then we'll break into small groups and take like those discussion questions to make it properly real about like internalizing what's going on around us. And I think, you know, I don't even know if we can yet properly integrate what's happened to the world and internally what will as a result happen to us. But I think we have to start off by giving it a bash. So let's think what's happened. If you go back 3 or 4 weeks, and I would have come and fortune told and said, you know, guys, what's going to happen is in a few weeks' time, there's going to be no airlines, no flights are going to be flying. Restaurants are closed, cinemas are closed, gyms are closed. Most countries in the world, schools are closed. Most countries in the world, you will not be allowed to leave your home but for basic necessities, food and medicine. And I would say to you, well, that's what's going to happen. Most people would think that you're a doomsday fortune teller and you have no validity, and there's no way that could ever happen to the world that we're in. And it's happened. It's actually happened. It's happened, and it's happened in a way that's even more profound than that there's immense questions as to the financial future of the world, as the global economy. So what does it mean for me? Step number one, there's 2 ways of seeing the world. One of the ways of seeing the world, and this is what causes, I suppose, makes us susceptible for trauma, anxiety, and depression, is when we feel that the script that we've written in our head, the narrative that we've told ourselves, is a predictable narrative, and it will carry out as told by me or as told by my society. It's the notion of a script that's been given to me, either one that I've composed myself or one that's been vested upon me by a larger structure. And that script has a direction, and that narrative has a way that it's going. And in that narrative, things like I'll be going to university, I can choose to go to the cinema, I can travel if I want to, all those things are embedded in that narrative. Now, what happens when that narrative gets shattered? How do we respond to that? So that depends, are we prisoners of that story or not? If we become prisoners of that story, we stop to see it as a story, and we start to see it as the reality. And when we perceive that as a reality, so if it collapses, we think life has come to an end. But really, the collapsing of that reality is the greatest opportunity to recognize, do you know what? It was just a fiction. It never was really there. It only ever appeared to be there, but it didn't ever have any real sustainable hold, and I'll prove it to you because it's gone. Now, that is the most immensely liberating thing that we could ever have, because as long as we're stuck in a narrative, we become limited by the story that our own ego can generate, and we can't really transcend beyond it. The second we recognize that it's only a story and it can change at any point in time, that flexibility opens up immense potential. But in order to do that, we should be taught one thing. You know, I was sharing with Ev and the others the other day that when a person goes parachuting, the most basic lesson that you teach the person before they even get off the ground is you teach them how to fall. And you probably practice by jumping off a higher ladder, because if you don't know how to fall, if you don't know how to hit the ground, so then jumping out of a plane is not a good idea. And because hitting the ground is such a crucial point for the recovery, so that's the thing you teach first. So essentially in life, we are constantly falling. If you could describe what life is a series of falls. And it's a series of, every fall essentially can be translated as what I thought would happen, didn't happen. What I thought would happen, didn't happen. What I thought would happen, didn't happen. What kind of adaptability, resilience do I have when that fall occurs? It depends on where I place the core of my identity. If the core of my identity is in the story that I've generated only from my own head, or from the very fragile structures that surround me, so then my world will be in this constant state of collapse, attempt to rebuild, collapse, attempt to rebuild. But if I could somehow discover a deeper connection to a reality which is constant and unchanging, and recognize that the events that occur in the world and in my life are not inside, but they're outside. They are things on the surface. Imagine a sea where on the top of the surface of the ocean, there's a huge amount of crashing waves and noise and foam. But as you go deeper, there's something which is solid and deep and consistent. If I could find that space and recognize that events will come and go, and people in my life are variables, and everything in my life is variable, but this thing, this consistent, this stable, this anchor, or let's call it reality. Reality is the thing that remains when everything else stops. Because if something can stop, it means it's not truly real. So now we're in an environment where lots of stuff has stopped, but we're all sitting and talking to each other, which means everything that we don't have was never real. And that brings us to the question, so what is reality? What is the thing that's going to be the sustaining quality that allows me to, through the face of constant changing and sometimes extremely painful adversity, remain anchored and rooted in a deeper perspective, in a deeper place? So that's step number one. Step number two is its relevance. The timing in terms of the Jewish year couldn't have been better. If we reflect on the idea of, the idea of Pesach is the exodus from Egypt. Speaking about Egypt really is one would think it's a ridiculous occupation, because the exodus happened 3,000 years ago. I mean, literally. I mean, why harp on? Why harp on? Who remembers Egypt apart from Egyptologists? The only people, even the Egyptians don't remember Egypt. The only people who remember Egypt and the exodus from Egypt are the Jews. And Ben Gurion, when he is making a plea to the United Nations for the establishment of the State of Israel, he used Egypt. And he said, those people who came on the Mayflower, you ask any American child, when the people left on the Mayflower, which was the first boat to bring the pilgrims to America, what clothes were they wearing? What date did they leave on? What food did they eat? Well, they won't be able to tell you. You ask any Jew until pretty recently, and Ben Gurion was about 72 years ago, so things have changed dramatically in that time. But certainly in his time, he said, if you ask any Jew from Yemen to New York, when did the Jews leave Egypt? They'll tell you on the 15th of Nisan. And what do they eat? And they'll tell you matzahs. And how were they dressed? They say, well, they were dressed in a hasty fashion. And you'd ask them, you say, and where were they going? And they say to you, we're going to the promised land. It's called Israel. And Ben Gurion turned to the United Nations and he said, that's 3,000 years ago, and that's still alive. This is our land. So this idea has remained fresh in our minds, so fresh that every year, like when I say to you the exodus from Egypt, it's familiar. Why is it familiar? What's so valuable about it? Why is the Pesach Seder a climax of the Jewish year in many, many ways? It's quite simple. Because On Pesach, we learned to let go of the fixed narrative, and we were liberated. Liberated means liberated from the story in my head. And how did that happen? Well, there was a people who were in servitude, and based on the predictable laws of a slave-master relationship, once a slave, always a slave. And then all of a sudden, nature began to become sabotaged. And one thing after another started to shift. And it started off with the main supply chain of all of Egypt, the financial resource, essentially the founder of all life in that society, suddenly started to bleed. Now, the image of blood is such a powerful image. It means the thing is dead. It's bleeding to death. The thing that they called their God, the thing that they relied on so deeply is now dead. It's just blood. And the narrative gets destroyed. And they cling on to it. Pharaoh's magicians say, but we can do that. And then there's frogs. And Pharaoh's magicians say, but we can do that. And then there's life. The earth literally changes to life. And then the magicians of Pharaoh say, we can't do that. There's something supernatural going on over here. We can't explain this. We don't know what's going on, but there's a higher power. And then step after step, every aspect of the natural world is literally sabotaged. Now, how do we perceive that? There's a wrong way and a right way of perceiving it. The wrong way is to say that there's nature and Hashem is more powerful than nature. But that implies duality, that there's two conflicting forces. One is stronger than the other. That's a antithetical idea to Jewish notion of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem is one. He controls everything. So what does it mean, the dominion over nature? It means that there is no such thing as water. It depends on what Hashem wants at that point in time. And he decided, you know what? For this reason, right now, that water is going to become blood. And it became blood. And the climax was the power of life itself. And at 12 o'clock, exactly midnight, the last plague, Hashem said to every firstborn Egyptian, stop breathing. And they stopped breathing on the spot, which means as follows. It's not that he overcame the power of breath. It's that there is no life but when it's generated by the spiritual energy that's being filtered into this world second by second, nanosecond by nanosecond, by a higher power. And that higher power manifests, weaves the tapestry of life in the way of his choice. And sometimes it looks very, very consistent, and other times it looks totally different. And therefore, the takeaway from Egypt is not supernature. It's not miracles. It's a different perspective of what nature is. Nature is a nature. Nature is a smokescreen to hide the fact that there is no such thing as nature. And if there's no such thing as nature, it means that there's no predictable cause and effect. There's only one reality. And that reality is the ultimate reality in the world, the ultimate spiritual truth. And that's where it's all at. And when we sink into that, so there's nothing else, and therefore everything always makes sense. Because I'm not locked into a fixed perspective of the way things should occur. Now that's a very easy idea to speak about, a very difficult idea to live by. So I'd like to, as we're about to break into our groups, I'd like to leave you with a few questions. I'd like to leave you with one question. First question is, until now, how did you perceive the value of the holiday of Pesach and the lessons that it teaches me in my contemporary life? Question number one. Question number two. How do I perceive the nature of society, the things which I thought were necessities? Do I still see them as necessities, or has there been a shift in my perspective? Do I need a cinema? Do I need a gym? Do I need a cafe? Or do I not need a cafe? Do I need a shopping mall? Do I not need a shopping mall? Has anything shifted in my perspective? Question number three. Moving forward in my life, is anything going to change about the way I relate to the fixed commodities in my society and in myself? Am I going to gain flexibility, or am I going to look at this as just a hiccup in a otherwise consistent life? So those are three questions I'd like you to ask. If you get through those three questions, so then you haven't discussed them properly. So I want to give you all a chance to really flesh this out, because I think this is more about internalizing than it is about preaching. So Ash, if you could take over and do the group stuff.
Rob, could you just give a summary again of the 3 questions?
Sure. Okay. Question number 1 is our response to, we've got this festival of Pesach coming up. Did we ever think it had any relevance to our perception of the world around us? What did we think Pesach did? What did Pesach do for me until now? And can my relearning and re-understanding of Pesach change the way I see the world? Number 1. Number 2, what has changed about my perception of the world around me? The way I relate to the things that I think were fixed parts of my life. Do I still respond to them in the same way? Question number 3 is what I anticipate changing in the future about my life based on the experiences that I've had through COVID-19. Before we break out, are there any questions or any people that can, oh gosh, chat, there we go.
No, it's just me writing the questions.
Okay. Okay, so should we, any questions before we break out, or should we break out?
Okay.
So mute yourselves and ask questions if you want to, otherwise we'll break out into our groups now. Okay, let's break out.
Yeah, so I think it'll be 15 minutes in the breakout rooms, and then if no one's done it before, they'll get a notification saying they're coming back into the main chat room, which we're in now. So I'm going to hit it now.
Are we the first back? How does that work?
Unbelievable.
Oh, what's this here?
Hi guys, our group's back. Woo!
Oh, Jody. Nice beard.
Everyone's breakout rooms worked fine.
It's a big test, not going well.
Hey, that was so smooth. Shkoyach.
Joel,
Oh.
the beards are amazing.
Back to Zoom.
Tio, Gadi, are you Tio? I didn't realize you were Tio.
We have Rabbi Segal. I feel like we lost him.
Joel, can I get a close up on that?
Rabbi, your
That's me, yeah.
microphone's muted.
Ah,
You'll have to do a private call for that.
Where's Rabbi Segal?
Has anyone,
I'm here, Ash.
Oh,
anyone
good.
been seeing Ash's virtual backgrounds?
No, I turned it off.
Oh,
Distracting.
It's phenomenal.
Thank you.
Okay.
Offside.
Guys, how was that? Was that productive?
Yeah.
Great. Great. Okay, so, and you know, I can only reflect on what was said in our group, but hopefully you all had some good insights, and I'm sure if you were the same as I, so then you probably felt like we had any time to actually fully flesh out the discussion. So I think it's just really what we do now is just opening up avenues of thought. But I want to reflect on some of the powerful points that came out. One of the points that came out in our session, but I think it's a fundamental point, is that Pesach is called the festival of freedom. And it brings to the fore the question of, well, what does it mean to be free? And our group pointed out that, ironically, being in my house with really no access to anything outside of it, and just my nuclear family around me, and not feeling compelled by work and uni and social commitments, has given me a different sense of freedom. Because it's given me a freedom to almost be myself. And so I think one of the most profound experiences that we've had in these times, and I've heard it from so many people, is that the idea of quarantine sounds so foreboding, but there's a point of it which is so liberating, because no longer do we feel committed to all these other things, which, and I would like to suggest this, which deprive us of freedom of expression, of freedom of self, and they impose onto us the ability to do lots of different things, but really, ultimately they become restrictive, because in our unending pursuit of meeting one commitment to the next, the inner self can sometimes remain dormant. So I'd like to go a bit further and just perhaps sum up what we did and give you some more food for thought in terms of the point that I began with. We had three questions: the impact of Pesach on us right here and right now, the way that we relate to life differently, perhaps because of what's happened with COVID-19, and our projections for the future. What we're going to do differently when please God, we come out of this. So I want to perhaps give a general overview of something which I think has become, certainly for me, a lot clearer, and I think for many. And that is this idea that the inner self has now become almost an inescapable topic for the world, because the outer self has essentially been completely closed down. So all we remain with is what we have. And now we have to think about, well, how do we respond to what we have? And that first experience of being alone with who I am can sometimes be uncomfortable, and it can sometimes be actually really scary. But if we're able to traverse the distance between that fear and start to engage, it can be immensely enriching. When we start to actually ask those fundamental questions about ourselves, and who am I, what is my role in life, and what is the most basic stuff that makes me up? What is it that makes me? What am I? And I think in terms of this, the fear can be perhaps a little bit mitigated with something which we have to learn how to do in order to gain access to our inner selves. The first step to gain access to the inner selves is what's called the practice of self-compassion. If we look at our inner self with judgment, we will never gain access to see who we truly are, because it will be too scary a place to go to. But if we approach our inner self with acceptance and compassion, so then the journey becomes a lot safer. And then we can start to explore all the dimensions of who we are. And generally we'll find that there's two things which make us up on a very broad scale. There's all the amazing things we are and all the terrible things we are. And we have to have both those things in mind, because there's no person that's perfect. So if we're going to go, if we're going to go mining in terms of our inner mind, our inner selves, so there is going to be stuff that we're going to find which is going to be amazing and really enlightening, and there's going to be stuff that's really dark and foreboding. And that's where inner compassion becomes a crucial component. Because if we start to say the good is good and the bad is bad, we'll never get very far, because as soon as we hit something bad, we'll retract and we will retreat. But if we recognize that the good is good and the bad is good, and both of those are necessary ingredients for a whole self. And I'll bring this in with a fascinating insight on the Seder plate. We're all going to celebrating the Seder, and mystically speaking, the Seder plate is arranged. Each part of the Seder plate is a different mystical representation, and they follow the rules of what's called the 10 Sfirot, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's really not important to have background to understand the point. They essentially are 3 different movements in our internal worlds, or in the way that Hashem relates to us. The one is love. I reach out and I connect. The one is self-control, discipline, power to contain myself. So one is extend myself out, and the one is I contract myself. One is a feeling of awe and reverence. One is a feeling of love and connection. Those are on the first 2 sides. One on the right, love. On the left, what's called Gvura, power, might. And in the middle, you have this incredible balance. Tiferes, it's called beauty. So it's fascinating. On the Seder plate, the shank bone, which is this outstretched arm that Hashem reaches out and grabs us out of Egypt, is love. The egg represents this containment, this restriction. And beauty is represented by the morrow, the bitter herbs. Now, if you had asked me for an analogy to beauty, my first go-to place would not be bitterness. But when we understand the nature of good and bad and diversity, it will allow us to be privy to where actual beauty occurs. Imagine a life where everything is only good. What will happen is it will become a very monotonous, very flat kind of life where there'll be no depth to it. What creates beauty in art and in music for sure is contrast. If you have a painting which is only beautiful, it's only these like really glorious sunlight, it's kitsch. There has to be an element of depth, of discord to create the beauty. Same thing with music. Same thing with relationships. If relationships were only ever smooth, it's a very empty relationship. Relationship needs drama. It needs diversity. It needs adversity. Life is made up with the composite of things which are extremely painful and things which are extremely pleasurable. The dark and the light, the beauty and the ugliness, and the composition of those is what creates beauty. And those are 2 really relationships. One is love and one is control. When Hashem relates to us, sometimes he reaches out and he embraces us. And it's so obvious. It's light. It's good. It feels amazing. And sometimes he moves back and it's invisible and it's dark and we don't know where we go. And beauty is when we embrace both those elements, then life becomes beautiful. And that's the bitterness of morrow that creates the beauty in life. That from the servitude of Egypt, we discovered the wealth of inner knowledge and spiritual transformation. When we look inside as well, beauty is by recognizing that there's this part of me which is powerful and giving and intelligent, and there's a part of me which is dark and self-serving and just out there for pleasure, whatever it is. And when I look at those 2 different parts of myself, then the wrestling occurs. But the wrestling occurs with the background, because behind everything, there's this always present, soft, just in terms of live drama, police car, in Israel, making sure people are staying inside in a naturally Israeli fashion. Sorry. Sorry. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but it's feisty. Okay, so that's our life, right? Policemen screaming at people, go back in the home, people going in the home, that's it. That's the richness of our being. And when I look inside of myself, that's the richness of who we are. Because behind it all, and this is the beauty, behind it all, behind the hiddenness, behind the revealedness, behind the composite, there's an overriding power that encompasses all. And just like behind all these different aspirations and expressions of Hashem, there's the oneness, the all good, which is behind the scenes, the solid presence of Hashem, which defies any definition. And all these things of love and hiddenness and power are just ways of interaction, but the reality is far beyond that. In myself as well, behind the good and the bad, there's my soul, there's my essence, which is beyond all that stuff. That stuff is always on the surface. That stuff is the stuff which comes and goes and changes, which brings beauty to my life when I recognize that that's not me, that's the stuff I do, that's the stuff I manifest, that's the stuff I express. But the essence and the core of me is way, way, way beyond that. And it's unchanging and constant and pure and inviolable. And that's what we can start to experience on Seder and Pesach. And through this experience is a recognition that there's something transcendent about us, and that all the movements of history and this elaborate tapestry that's been woven through the trials and tribulations, through the high points and the low points, has behind it this theme, this powerful energy that encompasses all. And when I recognize that, and when I speak from that place to the parts of myself, then it's transformational. Then I can be compassionate. Who's being compassionate to whom? The essential self can be compassionate to the good parts, can be compassionate to the bad parts, can incorporate it all. Because when I recognize that I'm beyond all that, so then I can see those parts with compassion and understanding. And by incorporating every part of my being into the realization of this is me, this whole being, so that becomes transformational, that becomes different, and that becomes liberating. What we're experiencing through this period of time is that everything can change, except the essence of being. That will always be constant. And when we relate to that inside ourselves, inside the world around us, so then we lose the fear. We become open to the inevitable nature of change. We become open to the unpredictability of what's going to be in the future. And we become these flexible, adaptive, resilient people, because we don't need things to be in place, because I'm not located in the outside structures. I'm located in the inner essence. And that's our work. And that work is always beginning, never ending. And that's what we're trying to do with our lives. And this is just another step in that direction. So I think we've kind of run out of time, but I'm happy to field questions if there are. Yeah, any questions, you can unmute yourselves and ask. An awesome silence. So it's an interesting, Zoom is an interesting format, and it's got this like, it's like this hybrid between almost connecting, but not quite there. So one of the challenges as teaching on Zoom or learning together with people on Zoom is there's like a bit of a foggy kind of sense of how the interaction is occurring. So in a way, I think I want to make that part of the beauty. Part of the beauty of this experience is that the distance we're all experiencing, just like when we're all in our homes, it's all about self-reflection. So this is not about me, and it's not about us together as being the compelling thing. It's about each one of us owning, engaging, and incorporating, delving into, exploring these ideas we've discussed tonight. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. And look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thank Rabbi, if the office still stands, I would love to ask a question. Maybe I'll open up the floodgates. It makes so much sense as to why we need resilience in order to be able to stand up against things that are outside of our control, and specifically when those things go in a negative direction. But is there a threat of perhaps then like numbing a certain sensitivity towards when things are fantastic, because we kind of have like, we want to detach from the external? So then, what happens when I win the lotto? Am I not as exuberant as I would have been if I was more sensitive?
That's a great question. And actually it's not about a detachment. It's actually about a deep experience. Because very often when we experience both good times and bad times, when we're not in our essential self, we're a little bit, we kind of avoid the pain of bad experiences, and we enter into good experiences with a drop of trepidation because we know they'll come to an end. And because we get so invested in happiness, we forget that life is made up of a composite of emotions. But when we have a strong sense of self, we're not scared about the stage afterwards because we recognize as a solid being. So we actually become more engaged in the moment, and we experience both emotions more powerfully. When it's painful, it's really painful, and when it's pleasurable, it's really pleasurable. And that's the beauty of Morrow, is the composite of those makes a rich life. I'll give an example. Of, I think there is a trend in society to become almost over positive. And there's a kind of I think it can be expressed as a saccharine kind of living. It's like sweet, but it doesn't have the real sense of sweetness. And that shows that when everything always has to be good, it actually means that nothing is good. And everything we're trying to make good is because we're too scared to engage in it. But when you have the solidity of self behind you, you have the right and you have the power to experience everything in a fullest dimension.
Rob, can I ask as well a question?
Go for it, Charlie.
What's your answer to question 3? What are you going to do differently as a result of all this?
So Charlie, I actually haven't tangibly figured out practical things because I feel like I'm still processing. But certain things, I'll tell you what's changed for me, and I think what's going to dictate the change. What's changed to me is my attitude towards my presence in my family. Spending 3 weeks with only my children and my wife and children around me has allowed me to see a different dimension of them as people, and my relationships transformed. And I don't want to lose that. It's allowed me to understand how many things in society, and I'm talking about even from a religious perspective, are just constructs. And they're not, you can daven without a minyan. You can still daven. You only have to have a minyan. You can learn without yeshiva. You can still learn. And in a way, I feel it's made everything I'm doing a lot more sincere and a lot more real, because it doesn't have a social tick next to it. There's no kind of external affirmation. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the direction of the changes that I'm going to be making. I need to hone in and make those, but I feel that each day is so different. I don't want to limit it as of yet. I'm just kind of focusing on directions more.
Awesome. Yeah, cool.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And have a very, very special Pesach, a liberating Pesach at every level. And really look forward to meeting again, both in Zoom and in person, where we can one day become in close proximity and even give a warm embrace.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.